The first man laughed before the auctioneer even finished describing them. "Those aren't cattle," he said loud enough for half the barn to hear. "Those are rugs with horns." That got another laugh. There were 3 of them standing inside the holding pen at the back of the Rock Springs livestock yard. All black and brown hair, heavy shoulders, short legs, and long coats hanging almost to the ground. They looked too shaggy for August, too slow for working stock, and too strange for ranch country where everybody knew what a cow was supposed to look like. The auctioneer tried again. 3 Tibetan yaks, 2 females and a bull. Seller needs them moved today. "Send them back to Tibet," somebody called. Another laugh. The yaks did not react. They stood together in the corner of the pen, facing the crowd with the calm, steady attention of animals that had already decided the noise was not worth answering. Most of the ranchers had come to buy Herefords, Angus cattle, or horses. Nobody had come for yaks, except Clara Bennett. She stood against the rail wearing an old canvas coat with one torn cuff, watching the animals while the men around her explained to one another why buying them would be foolish. Too wild, too slow, too much hair, not enough beef, no market, no reason. The auctioneer opened at $50 for all 3. Nobody moved. He dropped to 40, then 30. A man near Clara shook his head. "You'd spend more feeding those things than you'd ever get back." Clara looked at the yaks again. Then she raised one hand. The laughing stopped. She bought all 3 for $27. What nobody in that livestock yard knew was that Clara Bennett had made the decision to buy them 4 months earlier. She just hadn't known their names yet. Clara was 28 years old and had been running the Bennett place alone since her father died 2 winters before. The ranch sat in a high valley in southwestern Wyoming, where spring came late, winter came early, and the wind behaved as though it had a personal dislike for anything trying to stand upright. She owned 180 acres. On paper, that sounded respectable. In practice, almost 60 acres of it climbed into a cold north bench covered with bunchgrass, sage, rock, and patches of low brush that her father's cattle had never used well. The cows preferred the lower meadows. They always had. By November, the high ground usually looked much the same as it had in June, except colder. Her father had called it wasted country. Clara had grown up believing him. Then one January night, she found an article in an agricultural journal her father had kept in a wooden box beside the stove. The article was not about Wyoming. It was about livestock in Tibet and Central Asia. Most of it was academic enough that she nearly turned the page. Then she read one sentence twice. Yaks could remain productive on cold, high-altitude grazing that was marginal for conventional cattle. She pulled the lamp closer. The article described animals built for elevation, wind, poor forage, and long winters. That interested her. Then she reached the section about fiber. Beneath the coarse outer hair, yaks grew a soft insulating undercoat. In spring, that undercoat loosened naturally and could be combed or collected during shedding. Properly sorted, it could be spun into a warm, soft yarn. That interested her much more. Clara had learned something important during the 2 years she had operated the ranch alone. Land was not valuable because somebody said it was good land. Land was valuable when you could make it produce something people wanted. Her lower pasture produced beef. The north bench produced almost nothing. So she began writing letters. The first went to an animal science professor in Colorado, whose name appeared at the bottom of the article. She expected no response. 3 weeks later, she received 9 pages. The professor explained feed requirements, fencing, temperament, breeding, cold tolerance, parasite concerns, and the difference between the coarse guard hair and the fine down underneath. He also warned her about something she had already suspected. Yaks were not simply hairy cattle. Treat them that way, he wrote, and you will create unnecessary problems. Move slowly. Avoid crowding. Do not expect them to respond to pressure like domestic beef cattle. Give them a reason to trust a routine. Clara read the letter until the folds started to soften. Her second letter went to a specialty wool merchant in Denver. That answer was shorter. If the fiber was clean, properly separated, and fine enough, he would buy a sample. His price depended on quality. Clara wrote back and asked for a range. He sent one. She did the arithmetic at her kitchen table. Then she did it again. Then she walked outside in 20-degree weather, crossed the lower pasture, climbed the rise, and stood on the north bench, looking across 60 acres of grass, her cows barely touched. For the first time in her life, it did not look wasted. It looked empty. By March, she had rebuilt 2 sections of fence. By April, she had converted the old calving shed into a winter shelter, with a dry bedding area and a windbreak. She ordered a heavy comb used for fiber animals. She made a separate notebook. On the cover, she wrote one word, yak. Her neighbors did not know any of this. As far as they were concerned, Clara Bennett went to Rock Springs one August morning and spent $27 on 3 animals nobody else wanted. The joke started before she got them home. They continued for several weeks. One man asked whether she planned to start a circus. Another asked whether she had bought saddles for them. Clara smiled when she had to and ignored the rest. She had learned early that arguing with a man who had already decided you were wrong was usually a poor use of daylight. The 2 females she named Luma and Pema. The bull she called Dorje. The names came from a book the professor had recommended, though Clara's pronunciation was probably terrible. The Yaks did not seem offended. The first week was mostly about learning what not to do. Dorje did not like being pushed through gates. Luma disliked sudden movement. Pema disliked almost everything until she had studied it for several minutes. When Clara tried to move them the way she moved cattle, all 3 became tense. When she stopped trying to force the issue, things improved. So she changed. She carried hay into the pasture and set it down. Then she backed away. She stood near the fence without reaching for them. She walked the same route every morning, same gait, same bucket, same low whistle before feeding. For 4 days, none of them came within 10 feet of her. On the 5th day, Luma moved closer. Not much. 1 step. Clara pretended not to notice. The next morning, Luma came another step. By the end of the 2nd week, she would eat while Clara stood beside the feeder. Pema followed several days later. Dorje took nearly a month. The first time he approached her willingly, Clara was repairing a latch on the north fence. She heard breathing behind her and turned slowly. Dorje stood 6 feet away. His forehead was broad, his horns curved outward, and the hair around his shoulders moved in the wind like a dark curtain. Clara stayed where she was. Dorje watched. She watched the ground beside him instead of looking directly into his eyes. After a while, he lowered his head and began eating. That was the whole event. Nothing dramatic happened. But Clara understood what it meant. He had decided she could remain. It was during that same week that Thomas Hale first saw the Yaks. Thomas owned the ranch east of Clara's. 260 acres of cattle country. His family had worked for 3 generations. He was 34, broad-shouldered, quiet, and known in the valley for 2 things. He raised good Angus cattle, and he almost never stopped his truck unless something was broken. That September afternoon, he stopped. He had been driving home from town when he saw Dorje standing on the ridge. At first, he thought somebody's bull had gotten into Clara's pasture. Then the animal turned sideways. Thomas took his foot off the gas. Luma came into view behind him. Then Pema. Thomas pulled onto the shoulder. He sat there for several seconds. Then he got out. Clara was carrying a coil of wire toward the shed when she saw him at the gate. "You lose something?" she asked. Thomas nodded toward the ridge. "I'm trying to decide what I'm looking at. Yaks. I was afraid you were going to say that." Clara almost smiled. Thomas rested his forearms on the gate. Dorje had turned toward them. "So the stories are true." "Depends which stories." That you bought 3 hairy cattle nobody else wanted. They're not cattle. That sounds like something a person says right before explaining why the cattle aren't cattle. They're yaks. Thomas looked at her. Then at Dorje. Then back at her. What do they do? Clara could have explained everything. She could have told him about the letters, the fiber merchant, the north pasture, the notebooks, and the calculations covering 6 pages at her kitchen table. Instead, she said, "I'm finding out." Thomas nodded. That answer seemed to satisfy him more than a speech would have. He stayed 20 minutes. The next Saturday he stopped again. This time he brought back a fencing tool Clara had loaned him 6 months earlier. It was a poor excuse because neither of them remembered her asking for it. He stood at the gate and watched Luma eat. "You can get close to them now." "Closer. Can you touch one?" Luma. "Bull?" "Not yet." Thomas considered Dorje. "I wouldn't touch him either." "You weren't invited." Thomas looked at her, saw she was joking, and smiled. He came back the following week, then the week after that. At first, every visit included a question about the yaks. What did they eat? How much did they eat? Would they stay outside in snow? How heavy were they? How old were they? Clara answered when she knew. When she did not know, she said so. Thomas seemed to appreciate that. By October, the questions had started wandering. How was the well pump? Had she finished the south fence? Was she going to the Granger harvest supper? Did she need help moving hay before the weather changed? Clara noticed the change. She simply did not mention it. Thomas stopped pretending there was always a ranching reason to visit. That improved things. Before we get to the spring that changed what everyone in the valley thought those $27 yaks were worth, think about Clara's position for a second. Everyone around her could see the animals, only she had bothered to learn what they could produce. That difference was about to become very expensive. Winter arrived hard in November. The first major storm dropped nearly a foot of snow and drove wind across the Bennett place for 2 days. Clara moved her cattle into the protected lower pasture and spent most of the storm checking water, bedding, and fences. She worried about the yaks more than she admitted. They were supposed to handle cold. Supposed to, and actually did, were different things. At first light on the second morning, she pulled on 2 coats and crossed the yard. The wind hit hard enough to make her turn her face away. She expected to find Luma, Pema, and Dorje inside the shelter. The shelter was empty. Clara checked the gate. Closed. She walked around the barn. Nothing. Then she looked uphill. All 3 yaks were standing on the north bench in blowing snow. Not enduring it, standing in it, as though it were a mild afternoon. Dorje was pawing through the snow to reach grass. Luma had frost along the outer hair of her shoulders. Pema was chewing. Clara stood there for a long moment. Then she laughed. It was the first time she had laughed about the yaks since buying them. Thomas came by after the road opened. He found Clara breaking ice near the trough. "How'd your mountain cattle do?" "Better than yours, probably." He raised an eyebrow. She pointed to the ridge. The 3 yaks were out in the open. Thomas stared. "It was 8 below last night." "I know." "They know. They don't seem concerned." He watched them for another minute. Then he looked at Clara with a different expression than the one he had worn at the gate in September. Not convinced. Not yet, but interested. The winter told Clara several things. The first was that the professor had been right about their cold tolerance. The second was that the north pasture could carry more value than she had assumed. The third was that Dorje had learned her routine. By January, she could stand near him while he fed. By February, she could put a hand against his shoulder for a few seconds. By March, he would tolerate the comb touching his outer coat. Clara kept careful notes. Dates, feed, temperatures, behavior, cost. She recorded everything because memory had a way of improving good decisions and excusing bad ones. Numbers did neither. Then April came. The weather softened. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes. And one morning Clara found a tuft of brown fiber caught on a fence post. She stopped walking. The fiber was not coarse like the long hair hanging from the yak's sides. It was soft, very soft. She pulled off one glove and rolled it between her fingers. The spring shed had started. She took the tuft inside and placed it on the kitchen table. Then she opened the notebook. For 8 months, the entire idea had existed as research, fencing, feed bills, letters, and 3 animals standing in a pasture. Now the thing she intended to sell was sitting in her hand. The next 10 days changed the ranch. Luma was first. Clara started slowly, using the comb along the shoulder where the undercoat had already loosened. The fiber came free in soft clouds. Luma shifted once, then stood. Clara kept going. She worked in short sessions, never rushed, never pulled fiber that was not ready. Pema required more patience. Dorje required much more. But the routine they had built through winter mattered. The animals knew her hands. They knew the comb. They knew that standing quietly ended the session faster than fighting it. Every evening Clara carried the collected fiber inside. She sorted it at the kitchen table under a bright lamp. Coarse hair went into one sack. Clean down went into another. She removed grass, seeds, and bits of debris by hand. Thomas came by on the 4th evening and found her sitting at the table, surrounded by brown-gray fiber. He picked up a small piece. "This is what you wanted? This is part of it." He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger. His face changed. He had expected hair. What he held felt closer to very fine wool. "How much is this worth?" "I'll tell you when somebody pays me." Thomas looked at the sacks. "How much do you have?" "Not finished. That wasn't my question." "I know." He smiled. "You enjoy this." "A little." By the end of the shed, Clara had collected far more usable down than she had expected. Not all of it met her highest standard. She rejected anything contaminated, coarse, or mixed badly with guard hair. She weighed the cleanest portion twice. Then she packaged samples exactly as the Denver merchant had instructed. She wrote the contents and weight on every package. On Monday morning, she drove them to the rail station. After the boxes were gone, there was nothing left to do. That was the worst part. Work was easy, waiting was not. The merchant had promised an answer after grading the fiber. 5 days passed, then 8, then 12. Clara began wondering whether she had overestimated the market. On the 14th day, a letter arrived. She opened it standing beside the mailbox. The merchant wrote that the fiber was better than expected. The cleanest lots were soft, uniform, and suitable for luxury yarn. He wanted the entire shipment. He also wanted first option on the following year's production. At the bottom of the page was the amount he was prepared to pay. Clara read it once. Then again, then she walked back to the house, before allowing herself to calculate anything. The payment arrived several days later, $846. Clara placed the bank draft on the kitchen table. Her cattle had not cleared anything close to that the previous year. Not after hay. Not after veterinary expenses. Not after freight. Not after everything else cattle required before they became money. The Yaks had not produced $846 of pure profit. Clara knew better than to lie to herself that way. She had fence costs, feed costs, transport, the original purchase, equipment. But even after she deducted everything, the result was impossible to ignore. 3 animals had turned a piece of underused land into one of the strongest parts of the ranch, and 2 of those animals could produce calves. Clara opened the yak notebook. On a fresh page she wrote, 3 animals, then 6, then 10, then 15. She calculated pasture, winter feed, fiber yield, replacement females, fencing. She ran conservative numbers first, then worse numbers, lower prices, lower yields, higher feed. She tried to make the idea fail on paper. It refused. There was one problem: land. Her existing north bench could support a larger herd, but not the herd she now believed possible. The Dalton property bordered hers to the north, 140 acres. Rocky, cold, windy, poor cattle ground. It had been for sale almost 3 years. Asking price, $1,100. Clara had looked at it before and dismissed it for exactly the same reason everyone else had. Now she saw something different. She put the bank draft in the notebook. The next morning she rode north and spent 2 hours walking the Dalton fence line. Thomas found her there. He had been checking his own cattle when he saw her on the ridge. "You buying something?" "Maybe." He looked across the Dalton land. "This?" "Yes." "For cattle?" "No." He nodded slowly. "The Yaks." Clara handed him the letter from Denver. Thomas read it. Then he read the payment amount again. $846. "Yes." "From the hair. Undercoat." "You sold $846 of undercoat off 3 animals." "Yes." Thomas looked toward Dorje, Luma, and Pema grazing below them. Then he looked across the Dalton property. Clara could almost see him rebuilding the entire idea in his head. He was a rancher. He understood land. He understood carrying capacity. More importantly, he understood what it meant when an animal could use acres that conventional cattle undervalued. "What did you pay for them?" he asked. $27. Thomas laughed once, not because it was funny, because there was no other reasonable response. "All 3. He took off his hat and rubbed a hand through his hair. "I believe I made a joke about those animals." "You made several. I was hoping you'd forgotten. I keep good records." He looked at her. "I've noticed." Clara folded the letter. "I'm making an offer on the Dalton place tomorrow." Thomas did not answer immediately. He looked north, then south toward Clara's house, then back at her. "You've already run the numbers. 6 ways. And? 4 say buy it. What do the other 2 say? Buy it faster." That made him smile, but the smile disappeared after a moment. Something else had entered his expression. Clara waited. Thomas was good at taking his time with things that mattered. He stepped closer. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something without making it sound like I'm saying it because of this." He held up the letter. Clara looked at him. "Then don't talk about the letter." Thomas nodded. "That helps." He turned the hat in his hands. "I started stopping at your gate because I wanted to see the Yaks." "I know." "Then I kept stopping because I wanted to see you." "I know that too. You could have saved me some trouble. You seem to be managing." Thomas laughed quietly. Then he became serious again. "I don't care whether you raise yaks, cattle, sheep, or nothing at all. I don't care if this turns into the best idea in Wyoming or the worst." Clara glanced toward the letter. "It's not looking like the worst." "No." He smiled. "It really isn't." Then he stepped closer. "What I'm saying is, I'd like to be here for whatever comes next." Clara studied his face. For months, Thomas had asked questions without giving orders. He had offered help without assuming she needed rescue. When he thought something was foolish, he said so. When the evidence changed, he changed with it. Clara respected that more than charm. Charm was easy. Changing your mind when the numbers proved you wrong was much harder. "How long have you been planning to say this?" she asked. "Since before Christmas." "That's inefficient." "I know. You could have said it sooner." "I know that too." She looked toward the Dalton land, then back at him. "What exactly are you asking?" Thomas took one breath. "I'm asking whether I can court you seriously, with the intention of marrying you, assuming I don't ruin my chances somewhere between here and there." Clara considered him just long enough to make him uncomfortable. "Yes." Thomas blinked. "Yes? Yes." That was easier than I expected. I've been running those numbers too. This time he laughed hard enough that Dorje lifted his head from the pasture. "And if you've been wondering whether Clara's $27 decision had already paid off, it had." But the part people remembered later was not the first check. It was what she did with it. Clara bought the Dalton property, She did not buy a new truck. She did not replace the kitchen stove. She did not celebrate by spending the money that had finally proved she was right. She bought cold ground, 140 acres of the kind of country most cattlemen in the valley described with words like difficult, thin, and useless. By the end of summer, she had fenced the best sections for rotational grazing. Thomas helped set posts on the north boundary. He never once suggested putting his name on the deed. That mattered to Clara. Luma was bred that fall. Pema followed. The next winter was colder than the first. The Yaks did better than Clara's cattle again. By February, she had stopped worrying about whether they could handle Wyoming. The question had changed. Now she wondered how many Wyoming could handle. Luma delivered the first calf in early May. Clara found her just after sunrise in a sheltered fold below the ridge. The calf was dark, small, and already trying to stand. Clara stayed back. Luma knew what she was doing. Within an hour, the calf was nursing. Within 2 days, he was following her through the pasture. Clara named him Tashi. Pema produced a female calf 3 weeks later. That one Clara named Sonam. 5 Yaks. The notebook changed again. The Denver merchant renewed his agreement before the next spring shed. This time he offered a higher price for the best grade fiber. A small weaving company in Chicago requested samples after hearing about the shipment. They offered more. Clara did not immediately accept. Instead, she wrote both buyers and negotiated. Thomas watched her draft the letters one evening. "You enjoy that too, don't you?" "What?" "Making businessmen compete over hair." "Undercoat." "Of course." She looked up. "Yes, I enjoy it." They married that October in a small church in town. Almost everybody who had laughed at the Yaks attended. Nobody mentioned the livestock auction. Clara noticed. Afterward, one of the men who had called them rugs with horns walked up to Dorje's pasture fence in his good Sunday coat. He watched the bull for nearly a minute. Then he said to Clara, "You planning to sell breeding stock?" "Eventually." "What would a young female cost?" Clara told him. His eyebrows went up. "That much?" "Yes." He looked at Dorje again. Clara said nothing. Some lessons worked better when you allowed a man to finish them himself. Marriage changed less about the ranch than people expected. Thomas continued running his cattle operation. Clara continued running hers. They combined some equipment, labor, and winter feed planning, but they kept separate ledgers for the first 2 years. That had been Clara's idea. Thomas agreed immediately. The Angus cattle used the lower ground. The Yaks used the colder bench and the Dalton acreage. The arrangement was so obvious once it existed that people began talking about it as though it had always been obvious. It had not. That was another thing Clara learned. Once an idea worked, people became very good at remembering that they had almost believed in it from the beginning. By the spring of the 3rd year, the yak herd had grown to 9. The annual fiber harvest became a family event. Thomas handled gates and records. Clara did most of the combing because the animals trusted her hands. Tashi, now nearly grown, had inherited Dorje's calm temperament. Sonam was more suspicious. Clara liked her anyway. The Chicago Weaving Company signed a 2-year purchase agreement. The Denver merchant continued buying the lower grades. Nothing was wasted. Even the coarse guard hair found buyers for durable woven goods once Clara had enough volume to separate it properly. The numbers grew. Not explosively. Clara did not trust things that grew explosively. They grew steadily. That was better. A strong year paid for additional fencing. The next paid off the Dalton land. Another funded a larger hay shed. Thomas replaced the old truck only after the axle finally made the decision for him. Their first daughter, Ellen, was born the following summer. By the time she could walk, she knew that touching a yak required permission from both her mother and the yak. Their son, Robert, arrived 2 years later. He was less cautious. Luma corrected that once by turning her head and placing one enormous horn directly in front of him without touching him. Robert became cautious. Clara considered the lesson efficient. By then, people came from 3 counties to see the herd. Some were curious. Some wanted breeding animals. Some wanted to know about fiber. Clara answered serious questions. She had little patience for people looking for a miracle. When somebody said, "So yaks are easy money," she usually closed the notebook. They were not easy money. There had been fencing, research, feed, sorting, breeding problems, a calf lost during one bad spring, a buyer who paid late. A section of fence Dorje discovered was weaker than Clara thought. Hours spent combing fiber by hand. More hours removing grass and coarse hair from it. Markets had to be built, not merely discovered. But the economics were real. That was different. The North acreage had once contributed almost nothing to the Bennett Ranch. Now it supported the operation that produced the highest margin product Clara sold. The transformation had not come from changing the land. The land was exactly as cold, rocky, and windy as it had always been. She had changed the animal using it. By the 6th spring, Clara and Thomas owned 14 yaks. 9 were mature enough to contribute meaningful fiber. Several females were producing calves. The premium fiber contract alone brought in more money that year than Thomas's father had once earned from a much larger cattle herd in several seasons combined. Thomas stood at the kitchen sink when Clara told him the final number. He turned off the water. "How much?" She repeated it. He dried his hands carefully. Then he walked to the table and looked at the ledger himself. Clara had expected a joke. Thomas did not make one. He looked through the window toward the high pasture. The evening wind was moving through the yaks' long outer coats. Luma was older now. Dorje moved more slowly. Sonam had a calf beside her. Thomas rested both hands on the back of a chair. "I drove past this place the first time because I thought you'd lost your mind." "I remember. I almost didn't stop." "I remember that too." He smiled. "You remember everything that makes me look bad. Only the useful things." Thomas came around the table and put his arms around her. He rarely did that without saying something first. Clara let him. After a while he said, "You saw all this from 3 animals?" "No." He leaned back. "No. I saw enough to test it." That answer mattered, because Clara had never known the future. And she had not stood in that livestock yard and seen a husband, 2 children, hundreds of acres, contracts in 2 cities, and a pasture full of yaks. That would have been fantasy. What she had seen was much smaller. An animal suited to land she already owned. A fiber somebody had offered to buy. A purchase price low enough to survive being wrong. That was all. So she tested it. When the first test worked, she expanded. When the second worked, she expanded again. She let evidence earn the next decision. Years later, that was the part people tended to leave out when they told the story. They preferred the $27. It made a better story. Clara understood that. $27 for 3 unwanted yaks sounded like luck. Months of letters, fencing, cost calculations, market research, careful handling, grading fiber, negotiating contracts, and reinvesting profits sounded like work. Work was less magical. It was also more useful. On a cold May morning several years after the auction, Clara walked up the North Ridge with Ellen beside her. Ellen was old enough now to carry a small fiber sack. Robert followed Thomas 20 yards behind, asking questions without stopping long enough to hear the answers. The herd was spread across the slope, 16 animals, dark shapes against new spring grass. The wind was strong. It always was up there. Luma stood near the old fence line where Clara had first found shed fiber years earlier. She was gray around the face now. Ellen walked toward her slowly. Clara watched. "Not straight at her," she said. Ellen changed direction. "Let her decide." Ellen stopped. Luma raised her head. The old yak looked at the girl. Then she stepped closer. Ellen held out one hand. Luma smelled it. A moment later, Ellen placed her palm against the side of Luma's face. Thomas reached the top of the ridge with Robert. He stood beside Clara. For a while, neither of them spoke. Below them sat the original Bennett house. Beyond that were the cattle fields. To the north lay the Dalton ground, once considered poor pasture, now divided into carefully managed sections. A newer barn stood near the creek. So did the hay shed the fiber harvest had paid for. Two children stood among animals nobody in the county had understood when Clara bought them. Thomas looked across the herd. Remember what Ed Mercer called them? Clara did. Rugs with horns. Thomas smiled. Think he'd still say it? He tried to buy Sonam's daughter last fall. That's not an answer. It's a better one. The Yaks moved slowly across the ridge, their long coats lifted in the wind. Underneath that coarse hair was the soft fiber that had started everything. But even that was not really what had changed Clara's life. The important thing had been seeing value where everybody else saw inconvenience. The men at the auction had not been stupid. Most of them were good ranchers. They understood cattle, and that was exactly the problem. They looked at the Yaks and asked whether they were good cattle. They were not. They were poor cattle. They were slower, different to handle, unfamiliar. Their market was smaller. Judged by the rules of an Angus operation, they made very little sense. Clara had asked a different question. What are they good at? Cold, elevation, rough forage, fiber, unused land. Once she asked the right question, the answer looked completely different. That afternoon, she opened the original notebook. The cover was worn. The first pages contained cautious calculations, written by a woman who had owned exactly 0 yaks. Clara turned to the page where she had written the first purchase. 3 yaks, $27. Below it were the early fencing costs. Feed, transport, combs, letters. Then the first fiber payment, $846. Later pages held larger numbers. Land purchases, breeding stock, contracts, equipment, taxes, losses, profits. Nothing in the book was perfectly clean. Real businesses rarely were. But the direction was unmistakable. 3 animals had become 16. 60 underused acres had become productive pasture. 1 uncertain buyer had become multiple customers. A strange experiment had become the most valuable part of the farm. Thomas came into the kitchen carrying Robert, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder. Ellen followed with grass in her hair. Clara closed the ledger. You done with the numbers? Thomas asked. For today. That serious? She looked through the window. Dorje stood on the ridge in the fading light. Old now, still broad, still calm, still carrying the same ridiculous coat that had made a barn full of men laugh years earlier. Clara smiled. Numbers are only interesting until they tell you what you need to know. And what do these tell you? She looked at Thomas. That buying them was a good idea. He laughed. That's all? What else do you want? I was expecting something grand. You married the wrong woman. No. He shifted Robert higher against his shoulder. I don't think I did. The next spring, Dorje died quietly during the night. He was old for the years. Clara had known him, though nobody had ever been completely certain of his age. She found him near the upper fence at sunrise. Luma stood 20 feet away. The rest of the herd was farther down the slope. Clara sat beside him for a while. She thought about the first month when he would not come near her. The first winter when she discovered him standing happily in a storm that had driven every cow on the place behind a windbreak. The first time he let the comb touch his shoulder. The calves he had produced. The herd moving below her now. Thomas found her after breakfast. He did not say much. He sat beside her. That was enough. They buried Dorje near the north fence. Ellen placed a smooth stone over the ground. Robert asked whether Yaks went to heaven. Thomas looked at Clara. Clara said she had no data on the subject. Thomas laughed before he could stop himself. Then Clara did too. Even Ellen laughed. It felt right. By then, nobody laughed at the herd itself. That part was over. The animals that had once been the cheapest lot at an auction had become breeding stock ranchers were willing to drive hundreds of miles to buy. The land that had once been described as barely worth fencing had become valuable because Clara had found an animal suited to it. The woman people had teased for buying rugs with horns was now the person they visited when they wanted advice about putting difficult acres to work. Clara never reminded them of the auction. She did not need to. Success has a way of remembering things for you, and that is where the story could end. With the contracts, the land, the children, the herd, the money. But Clara never thought the money was the most interesting part. The most interesting part happened before anybody knew she was right. It happened in January, alone at a kitchen table, when she read something that did not fit what everyone around her believed. Then, instead of dismissing it, she checked. She wrote to somebody who knew more than she did. Then she wrote to somebody who might actually pay. She calculated the downside. She prepared the land. Only after all of that did she raise her hand at the auction. The crowd saw a woman making a strange bet. Clara knew she had already done most of the work required to make the bet small. There is a difference between being reckless and being early. From the outside, they can look exactly the same. The only person who knows which one you are is the person who did the homework. Years later, Clara and Thomas would sometimes sit on the porch in the evening and watch the yaks move across the high ground. Their coats would catch the last light. The calves would stay close to the cows. The wind would come down hard from the ridge, the same wind that had made Clara's father call that pasture useless. Nothing about the wind had changed. Nothing about the rocks had changed. Nothing about the short growing season had changed. Only the way Clara understood them had changed. That was enough, because sometimes the opportunity is not hidden. Sometimes everybody can see it. They simply see the wrong thing. At the livestock yard, they saw animals that did not fit the system they already understood. Clara saw animals that might fit the land she already had. They saw too much hair. She saw fiber. They saw cold pasture. She saw an environment the animals were built to use. They saw $27 thrown away. She saw a test she could afford to run. And years later, standing on the same kind of bitter, windy ground that had once produced almost nothing, Clara could look at a herd large enough to support her family and know exactly where it had started. Not with courage, not with luck, not even with the yaks. It started with a question. What if everybody is judging the wrong thing? If you've ever had an idea people laughed at before they understood it, you probably know why Clara never forgot that auction. The laughter was not the important part. The important part was that she did not let it change the math. She bought the animals. She built the fence. She learned their behavior. She found the market. She waited through winter. She collected the fiber. She kept the records. Then she let the results speak. By the time everyone else stopped laughing, Clara had already moved on to the next calculation. And the yaks, as far as anyone could tell, had never cared what the crowd thought in the first place.